What happens when a man's heart is shattered into 1,000 pieces? For Marshall Blackwood, a man sworn to lead 200 souls to the promised land of Oregon, it happened under a vast, merciless sky. His world ended not with a gunshot or a raid, but with the silence that followed a final, exhausted breath. In the back of a canvas-covered wagon, his beloved wife Leora gave him 2 beautiful children and paid for them with her life. Consumed by a grief so profound, it twisted into madness, Marshall would make a decision so shocking, so unthinkable, it would haunt the Oregon Trail forever. A decision that forced a desperate, childless woman to risk everything to defy him. This is the story of that choice, the lives it shattered, and the found family it forged in the unforgiving crucible of the American West. The Wyoming sky in the summer of 1852 was a boundless, unforgiving sheet of blue bleached pale at the horizons by a sun that offered light, but no mercy. For 3 months it had been the constant companion to the Blackwood Hale Wagon Company, a sprawling, slow-moving serpent of canvas and wood, creeping its way toward the promised green of Oregon. At its head was Marshall Blackwood, a man carved from the very grit and determination the trail demanded. At 32, his face was already a testament to the elements, skin tanned to the color of worn leather, and etched with fine lines around eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was a fair leader firm, but just a man who could set a broken axle, navigate by the stars, and calm a nervous pioneer with a steady word. His authority was absolute, earned not through bluster, but through a quiet competence that radiated from him like heat from the sun-baked earth. His world, his entire universe, resided in the lead wagon. It was there his wife Leora had made a home amidst the jolting and the dust. Her laughter was the melody that cut through the monotonous groan of the wheels, her presence the soft counterpoint to the trail's harsh reality. She was carrying their first child, their first children, as the midwife Martha had suspected weeks ago, and her belly round and high was a promise of the life they would build in the Willamette Valley. Every evening, Marshall would sit beside her, his large, calloused hand resting on that taut drum of life, feeling the fluttering kicks and imagining a future painted in the vibrant colors of their dreams. He wasn't just leading a wagon train. He was leading his family to a new genesis. The labor began just as the company was making camp near the Sweetwater River. It was a difficult, brutal affair. The heat in the wagon was suffocating, turning the small space into a stifling oven. Martha, a stout woman, whose face was a road map of past sorrows and frontier pragmatism, worked with grim focus, her brow beaded with sweat. Hours bled into one another. Leora's cries, at first strong and determined, grew weaker, frayed with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Marshall paced outside, his knuckles white as he gripped the wagon's side, the sounds tearing at him, rendering him helpless in a way no river crossing or threat of raiders ever had. He was the master of this rolling domain, yet in this most crucial of moments, he was utterly powerless. The first cry, thin, reedy but alive, pierced the oppressive evening air, just after sunset. A boy. Marshall's heart seized with a dizzying mix of relief and pride. He heard Martha's weary encouragement, Leora's faint, agonized push. And then a second cry, fainter than the first, joined the chorus. A girl. Twins. A son and a daughter. It was a miracle, a bounty beyond their wildest prayers. A wave of euphoria washed over Marshall, so potent it nearly buckled his knees. He was a father. He lunged for the wagon flap, his face split by a grin, ready to sweep Lyora into his arms. But the hand that stopped him was Martha's, and her face was a mask of grim foreboding. "Stay back, Marshall. Not yet." The euphoria evaporated, replaced by a cold dread that slicked his skin. He could hear frantic, low whispers from inside the clink of a metal basin, a soft, desperate keening that wasn't coming from the infants. He waited, his world shrinking to the canvas flap of the wagon, every second stretching into an eternity. The camp, usually bustling with the sounds of supper and settlement, seemed to hold its breath. Even the river sounded hushed, expectant. Finally, after a lifetime had passed, in the space of 20 minutes, Martha emerged. Her apron was stained with a terrifying amount of blood. She didn't need to say a word. The story was etched in the deep, sorrowful lines of her face, in the hollow pity of her eyes. "She's gone." "Marshall," the midwife said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper that was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the plains. The bleeding. It wouldn't stop. She saw them just for a moment. She named them, Caleb and Abigail. Then she slipped away. Marshall stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. The words didn't make sense. Gone Lyora. His Lyora, whose scent of lavender and campfire smoke was still on his shirt, whose laughter was still echoing in his ears. He pushed past Martha, stumbling into the dim, lantern-lit interior of the wagon. The scene would be burned into his memory for the rest of his days. Lyora lay on the mattress, her face pale as alabaster in the flickering light, a serene, almost peaceful expression on her lips. She looked like she was merely sleeping. But the stillness was absolute. The life force that had animated her so vibrantly, so completely, was extinguished. Beside her, wrapped in clean linen, were two tiny, wrinkled, red-faced bundles. They were the cause. They were the price. A sound escaped Marshall's throat, a raw, animalistic howl of a man whose soul had been ripped from his body. He didn't see two miracles. He saw two thieves. They had stolen her breath, her light, her future. In that moment of pure, undiluted agony, something inside him shattered. The competent leader, the loving husband, the hopeful father, they all died with Lyora. What was left was a hollow shell, filled with a grief so vast and so violent, it demanded an outlet. He barely registered the next 2 days. They buried Lyora on a small rise overlooking the river, a simple wooden cross marking the spot where all his dreams now lay interred. The women of the train took turns with the twins cooing over them, trying to coax drops of precious watered-down cow's milk into their tiny mouths. They offered Marshall condolences, plates of food he couldn't eat, and sympathetic glances he couldn't bear. He saw accusation in their pity, judgment in their kindness. He retreated into a dark, silent world. He drank. The whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes became his only solace, dulling the sharp edges of his pain into a throbbing, constant ache. He would stand by the river at night, staring west, not at the future, but at the endless, mocking darkness. The cries of his children, carried on the night air from a neighboring wagon, were like daggers to his heart. They were Lyora's death knell, a constant wailing reminder of what he had lost. On the third morning, Marshall Blackwood walked into the center of the circled wagons, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish, unnerving light. He climbed onto a crate, his movements stiff and unsteady. The camp fell silent, sensing a shift, a crack in the foundation of their small, rolling society. "I can't take them," he began, his voice rough raw from whiskey and unshed tears. The pioneers exchanged uneasy glances. They assumed he meant he needed help, a wet nurse, a permanent arrangement for their care on the trail. Several women, including the kind-hearted Mrs. Gable, began to step forward. Marshall held up a hand, silencing them. A dark, twisted logic had taken root in the barren soil of his grief. He saw the path forward, a way to cut the cancer out, a way to punish the world for taking Lyora from him. "I can't take them," he repeated, his voice gaining a strange, chilling strength. "They need a mother, a family, something I can no longer provide. This company is bound for Oregon. It's a hard journey. A babe in arms is a burden. 2 is a curse." Obadiah Smith, a grizzled trapper and Marshall's second-in-command, stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Marshall, what are you saying?" "Folks will help. We'll manage." Marshall's gaze swept over the crowd, but it was vacant, unseeing. He was a man addressing ghosts. "Help isn't enough," he declared, the words dropping like stones into the stunned silence. "They need a proper home, a real claim. So I'm offering one, a chance for a family to have what they've always wanted. An heir, a legacy." He paused, letting the weight of his unhinged proposal settle. "I will give my children to the family that makes the best offer. You're all heading to Oregon to claim land to build a future. What is that future worth to you? What is a son worth? A daughter? You will bid. Not with money, with stock, with acreage off your future claim, with whatever you have that proves you can provide for them. We will hold an auction, right here, right now." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. An auction, for his own flesh and blood. It was monstrous. It was unthinkable. Men looked at their wives in horror. Women clutched their own children closer. This wasn't the Marshall Blackwood they knew. This was a man possessed by a demon of grief, a stranger standing on a crate and proposing the unthinkable. In the back of the crowd, a woman named Lydia Abernathy, a quiet, solitary figure who rarely spoke to anyone, felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, clasped tightly at her waist, began to tremble. For years her arms had ached with an emptiness no one could see. And now she was witnessing a father mad with sorrow, trying to create that very same emptiness in his own life twice over. The silence that followed Marshall's declaration was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was broken by the nervous cough of a man, the scandalized whisper of a woman, and the distant, innocent cry of one of the very infants being discussed. The pioneers stared at their leader, their expressions a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a morbid, terrified curiosity. Obadiah Smith looked as though he'd been struck. "Marshall, you've lost your senses. This is Lyora's blood you're talking about." "Your blood? You can't put a price on kin. I'm not putting a price on them." Obadiah Marshall retorted, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm ensuring their survival. I'm a dead man walking. My heart is in a grave by the Sweetwater River. What can a ghost offer 2 living children? A life of misery. A shadow for a father. No. They deserve more. They deserve a home that isn't haunted." His gaze swept across the assembled families. "Think of it," he urged, his tone shifting into that of a twisted salesman. "The Miller family. You have 3 daughters. What would you give for a son to help work your claim? Mr. Gable, your wife has a good heart. Your land will be fertile. What's a few acres off a 640-acre plot in exchange for a legacy? He was weaponizing their ambitions, their dreams of a new life in Oregon against them. He was forcing them to confront the raw, transactional nature that lay hidden beneath the veneer of community. A few men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting towards their wives. The idea was abhorrent, a violation of all that was decent. And yet, the seed was planted. A son, a daughter, ready-made heirs without the risk and pain of childbirth on the trail. A man named Hatcher, a thin, ferret-faced speculator who had joined the train in Fort Laramie, watched the scene with narrowed, calculating eyes. He had no wife, no desire for children, but he understood currency. And he saw that in this broken man's madness, there was a unique form of power at play. It was then that Lydia Abernathy began to move. She was a woman who had perfected the art of being invisible. At 35, she was plain in a way that seemed deliberate, her brown hair always pulled back in a severe bun, her calico dresses always faded to a muted grey. Her husband Thomas had been taken by cholera a year before a quiet, gentle man who had understood the deep, abiding sorrow of her barrenness. They had tried for 15 years. They had prayed, they had visited doctors in the East. They had drunk bitter herbal remedies offered by old women. Nothing. The emptiness in her womb was a constant hollow ache, a grief for children she had never held. Since Thomas's death, she had become a ghost on the wagon train, doing her chores with quiet efficiency, speaking only when spoken to. Her loneliness a shroud no one dared to pierce. But Marshall's words had pierced it. They had lanced a wound she thought was scarred over and set it bleeding anew. As she pushed her way through the murmuring crowd, she wasn't thinking. She was feeling. A white-hot rage mixed with a profound, soul-deep empathy. She understood grief. She lived it every day. But this was a desecration. She stopped at the foot of the crate, her small frame dwarfed by Marshall's looming, unsteady figure. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. Her pale blue eyes, usually downcast, now blazing with an intensity that made him falter. "Get down from there, Mr. Blackwood," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with an authority that cut through the tense air. Marshall blinked, as if seeing her for the first time. "Mrs. Abernathy, do you have a bid? You have no husband, no land to offer." "I said get down," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly, but unwavering. "You will not do this. You will not stand there and cheapen the memory of your wife and the lives of your children. This is not a marketplace, and those babies are not livestock." A murmur of support rippled through the crowd. Lydia's courage was giving voice to their own horror. "You don't understand." Marshall snarled, his face contorting in pain. "You have no idea what I've lost." "I lost my husband on this trail." Lydia shot back, her voice cracking with a year's worth of unshed tears. "I know what it is to bury the person who holds your heart. And I know what it is to wake up every morning with empty arms and an empty future. I know grief, Mr. Blackwood, but I also know it is not an excuse to abandon your duty. It is not a license to inflict more pain." She took a breath, her gaze sweeping over him, seeing not the madman on the crate, but the shattered husband beneath. Her tone softened, turning from fury to a desperate plea. "She gave them to you, Marshal," she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that only he could hear. Leora. They were her last gift, her last act of love in this world. She trusted you with them. Are you going to throw that trust away? Are you going to sell her final gift to the highest bidder? The mention of Leora's name, spoken with such reverence, was the blow that finally broke through his wall of whiskey and grief. Marshal flinched as if he'd been physically struck. His shoulders slumped. The feverish light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a wave of crushing, unbearable shame. He looked down at his hands, large, capable hands that had built and fixed and guided, and now they were trembling instruments of a terrible, proposed betrayal. He stumbled off the crate, the ground seeming to rush up to meet him. Lydia didn't stop. She pressed her advantage, her voice rising again for all to hear. "You say they need a mother? You say you cannot care for them? Then let me. I will do it." The crowd gasped. Obadiah looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Lydia, what are you saying?" "You alone." "Yes, me," she affirmed, turning to face the pioneers. "I have milk from my goat. I have a wagon. I have 2 hands and a heart that has been waiting a lifetime for a purpose. I have nothing to offer in terms of land or stock. I cannot bid in Mr. Blackwood's cruel auction. My bid is this: I will care for them. I will feed them, clothe them, and protect them with my life until we reach Oregon. I will be their mother in every way but blood. And I will do it not for a claim or for a legacy, but for them. And for the memory of Leora, a woman I barely knew but whose courage I will honor." She turned back to Marshal, who was now leaning against the crate, his head in his hands. "This is my offer, Mr. Blackwood, not a purchase, a promise. Give them to me, let me be their sanctuary until you find your way back from the darkness." Marshal didn't look up. He couldn't face her. He couldn't face any of them. He just nodded a single jerky movement. The auction was over before it began. A collective sigh of relief went through the company. Mrs. Gable hurried to Lydia's side, patting her arm. "Oh, you dear, brave woman. We will help you, of course." But the matter was not entirely settled. The speculator Hatcher stepped forward, a sly, unpleasant smile on his thin lips. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice slick as snake oil. "But a verbal agreement made under duress isn't exactly binding. Mr. Blackwood is the legal guardian. He's clearly not in his right mind. What's to stop him from changing his mind in a week or a month? For the children's stability. Perhaps a more formal arrangement is required. A contract. Witnessed." Obadiah bristled. "What are you getting at?" "Hatcher." Hatcher shrugged, holding up his hands in a gesture of false innocence. "Just thinking of the children's welfare. A woman alone with no claim to them, and a father who one day tries to sell them and the next gives them away. It's an unstable situation. Someone needs to ensure things are done properly." He looked from Marshall's broken form to Lydia's determined face, and a flicker of an idea seemed to cross his mind. He was a man who knew how to exploit a chaotic situation, and this was the most chaotic he had ever seen. Lydia met his gaze without flinching. "Then let's make it formal," she said, her voice clear and strong. She walked over to the back of Obadiah's wagon and procured a piece of paper, an inkwell, and a pen. She brought them to Marshall. "Write it down, Mr. Blackwood," she commanded softly. "Write that you are entrusting Caleb and Abigail Blackwood to my care for the duration of this journey, that I will act as their guardian." so there can be no question. No one, she added, casting a sharp glance at Hatcher, can dispute it. With a trembling hand, Marshall took the pen. On the rough surface of the crate, he scrawled a few jagged lines, his signature barely legible. Obadiah and 2 other men signed as witnesses. Lydia took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it in the pocket of her dress. It was her shield, her proof, her promise. She then walked to the wagon where the twins were being kept, the women parting before her like the Red Sea. She entered the canvas shelter and emerged a moment later, a tiny sleeping bundle in each arm. She walked back to Marshall, holding them out for him to see. "This is your son Caleb," she whispered, indicating the one in her right arm. "And this is your daughter Abigail." For the first time since their birth, Marshall truly looked at them. He saw the tuft of dark hair on his son's head, so like his own. He saw the delicate curve of his daughter's cheek, an exact replica of Leora's. His face crumpled, and a single hot tear, the first he had shed, escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He reached out a hesitant, shaking finger and gently touched Caleb's hand. The baby's tiny fingers instinctively curled around his, a grip of surprising strength. It was not a moment of healing, not yet, but it was a crack of light in the profound darkness. He had given them away. But in doing so, Lydia Abernathy, the quiet woman he'd never noticed, had just saved him from an unforgivable sin. The journey ahead was long, and the ghosts were not yet banished, but for the first time in 3 days, the future held something other than a gaping void. It held the faintest glimmer of a promise clutched in the tiny, trusting hand of his son. The wagon train moved on, but its heart had changed. The steady, rhythmic beat of progress was now underscored by a tense, uncertain arrhythmia. Marshall Blackwood resumed his duties as leader, but he was a hollowed-out version of his former self. He rode at the head of the column, his shoulders slumped. His gaze fixed on the distant horizon, a man going through the motions. He issued commands, scouted the trail, and negotiated with the land, but the quiet confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, silent detachment. He was a captain steering a ship, but his own vessel was wrecked. The center of the train's new gravity was Lydia Abernathy's wagon. It had transformed from a solitary, mournful space into a bustling, chaotic nursery. The twins were demanding tyrants. They cried for milk at all hours, their wails cutting through the canvas and serving as a constant public broadcast of Lydia's new reality. Her quiet, orderly life was shattered. Her days were a blur of heating diluted goat's milk over the fire-washing soiled linens in precious water, and pacing the confines of her wagon, rocking a child in each arm, her own body aching with a fatigue she had never known. Yet it was an ache she welcomed. The hollowness in her arms was finally filled. When she looked down at Abigail's delicate, sleeping face, or felt Caleb's tiny fist clench her finger, the exhaustion melted away, replaced by a fierce, protective love that was as powerful as it was unexpected. This was real. This was purpose. She had stepped into the void of the Blackwood family's tragedy, and found to her astonishment that it was giving her a reason to live beyond mere survival. The other women of the train, led by the matronly Mrs. Gable, rallied to her side. They brought her extra rations, spelled her for an hour, so she could catch a snippet of sleep, and offered an endless stream of advice, some useful, some not. "You must keep their feet warm, Lydia. It wards off the colic." My mother swore by a bit of sugar water to quiet a fussy babe. Lydia accepted their help with quiet gratitude, but she was the one who bore the true weight of the responsibility. She was their mother now in practice, if not in name. Marshall kept his distance. A wall of shame and grief stood between him and Lydia's wagon. He would watch from afar as she tended to the children, his heart a tangled knot of conflicting emotions. He felt a flicker of gratitude so profound it was painful, but it was poisoned by resentment. Her competence was a mirror to his own failure. Her loving care was a constant reminder of the monstrous act he had almost committed. Every time he heard the babies cry, he flinched, torn between the instinct to go to them and the powerful urge to ride away and never look back. The children were a living link to Lyora, and looking at them was both a comfort and a torment. Abigail had Leora's eyes a deep, soulful blue that seemed to see right through him. Caleb had her stubborn chin. Sometimes in the dead of night he would walk to the edge of the camp and stand there listening. He could just make out the soft lullaby Lydia would hum, a simple, nameless tune. It was the sound of the life he was supposed to have, a life now, being lived by a stranger. The speculator Hatcher watched all of this with keen interest. He saw the power vacuum created by Marshall's broken spirit. A wagon train, Hatcher knew, was a microcosm of society, and it needed a strong leader, especially as they entered the more treacherous stretches of the trail. He began to sow seeds of dissent, his words as subtle and poisonous as hemlock. A crying shame about Blackwood, he'd say to a group of men gathered around a campfire. Fine leader he was. But a man's spirit can break just like an axle. Can a man who tried to sell his own children be trusted to see us through the Blue Mountains? He'd approach the families who were growing weary of the journey, their optimism worn thin by the relentless dust and hardship. The pace has slowed since. The incident, he'd murmur, gesturing vaguely toward Lydia's wagon. We're losing precious time. Winter will catch us on the slopes if we're not careful. The captain seems more concerned with his own ghosts than our progress. Hatcher never mentioned Lydia or the children directly in a negative light. Instead, he framed his concern around Marshall's instability. He was chipping away at the foundation of Marshall's authority, presenting himself as the logical, clear-headed alternative. He was a man of business. He implied a man who wouldn't let personal tragedy cloud his judgment. The whispers found fertile ground. The journey was hard, and fear was a constant companion. A few families began to look at Marshall with doubt. They saw the haunted look in his eyes, the way he sometimes seemed 1,000 miles away, and they wondered if Hatcher was right. The brewing tension came to a head when Caleb fell ill. It started with a fever, a listlessness that terrified Lydia. His cries became weak and pathetic, and he refused to take milk. Panic seized her. The trail was no place for a sick infant. There were no doctors, only Martha, the midwife, whose knowledge was limited to herbs and common sense. Lydia did everything she could. She bathed him in cool water. She tried to force droplets of liquid between his cracked lips. She prayed with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. But he only grew weaker. After a day of this, her face etched with fear and sleeplessness, she knew she couldn't do it alone. Swallowing her pride, she went in search of Marshall. She found him by the river, skipping stones across the surface with a grim, mechanical motion. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice hoarse. He turned his expression guarded. "Mrs. Abernathy." "It's Caleb," she said, the words tumbling out. "He's sick. A terrible fever. He won't eat. I don't know what to do." For the first time in weeks, the fog of detachment in Marshall's eyes cleared, replaced by a sharp, focused alarm. Caleb, his son. The primal instinct of a father long suppressed by grief surged to the surface. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the stones and strode past her toward her wagon, his long legs covering the ground quickly. He knelt by the small pallet where Caleb lay, a tiny, flushed figure wrapped in linens. Marshall placed his large hand on the baby's forehead. The heat was terrifying. He looked at the child's glazed eyes, the rapid, shallow breaths. He had seen this before. Trail fever. It took the weak, the old, and the very young with merciless efficiency. "We need to break the fever," he said, his voice regaining the authority it had lost. "Keep bathing him." "Martha," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the camp. "Bring me willow bark." Now. For the next 24 hours, Marshall and Lydia became an unwilling team, united by a single purpose. They worked side by side in the cramped confines of the wagon. Marshall, using the knowledge passed down from his own father, brewed a bitter tea from the willow bark, forcing it drop by drop into Caleb's mouth. Lydia, her movements deft and gentle, continuously bathed the baby's small, hot body with strips of cloth dipped in cool river water. They barely spoke. There was no need. An unspoken truce existed between them. In that small, lantern-lit space, they were not the broken leader and the lonely spinster. They were a father and a mother fighting for the life of their child. Marshall saw the raw exhaustion on Lydia's face, the fierce determination in her eyes, and his resentment began to dissolve, replaced by a grudging, profound respect. Lydia saw the terror and the love warring in Marshall's expression as he held his son, and she saw the man Lyora must have loved, the man buried beneath the mountain of grief. As dawn broke on the second day, Caleb's fever finally broke. His skin, once fiery hot, was now cool and damp with sweat. He let out a weak but insistent cry, a cry for food. Lydia, weeping with relief, quickly prepared some milk, and this time he drank, his small mouth working greedily. Marshall sat back on his heels, the tension draining from his body, leaving him utterly spent. He watched Lydia coo softly to Caleb, her face illuminated by the morning light, and a love so pure it was almost blinding. "Thank you," he whispered the words, feeling heavy and inadequate. Lydia looked up, her eyes meeting his. "He is your son, Mr. Blackwood. He needs his father." Before Marshall could respond, the shadow of a man fell across the wagon's opening. It was Hatcher, his face a mask of false concern. "I heard the child was ill," Hatcher said smoothly. "It seems a good leader must also be a nursemaid. I trust this hasn't delayed us too much. The mountains wait for no man, especially not one distracted by domestic troubles." The insinuation was clear, the timing venomous. He was using this moment of vulnerability to challenge Marshall in front of Lydia. Marshall rose slowly to his full height, his large frame filling the wagon's entrance. The weariness on his face was replaced by a cold fire. He had been adrift for weeks, lost in a sea of sorrow, but the fight for his son's life and Hatcher's blatant attempt to exploit it had awakened something in him. "My son's welfare is not a distraction," Hatcher Marshall said, his voice low and dangerous. "It is a responsibility, something you know nothing about. This train moves when I say it moves. If you have a problem with my leadership, you can challenge me in front of the council tonight. But if you ever again imply that my children are a burden, I will personally see to it that you walk the rest of the way to Oregon." Hatcher's smirk faltered. He had miscalculated, mistaking Marshall's grief for permanent weakness. He saw now in the man's steady, cold eyes the return of the leader he had sought to usurp. He took a step back, offering a placating gesture. No offense intended, Blackwood. Merely concerned for the company. I am the one concerned for this company, Marshall stated flatly. And I am its leader. Do not forget that again. Hatcher nodded curtly and retreated his plot for a quiet coup thwarted for now. Inside the wagon, the silence was heavy. Marshall had not just defended his son. He had defended his role as a father, a role he had tried to abdicate. He had drawn a line in the sand. He looked from the retreating figure of Hatcher to Lydia, who was watching him with a new, unreadable expression. The fragile truce forged in the heat of a fever had just been tested, and for the first time it felt like it might just hold. Marshall's confrontation with Hatcher was a dam breaking. The stagnant water of his grief, which had threatened to poison the entire company, had finally found an outlet in righteous anger. Word of the exchange of their leader's cold fire and his unwavering defense of his son spread through the camp like wildfire, extinguishing the smoldering whispers of dissent. The pioneers had witnessed not the broken widower, but the return of the resolute leader they had chosen to follow into the unknown. The incident had forced Marshall to act, to defend, to inhabit the role of a father he had so violently abdicated. The desperate primal fight for Caleb's life had tethered him back to the world of the living, his anchor cast not in duty, but in a love he was only just beginning to comprehend. He did not, however, reclaim his children. To march into Lydia's wagon and take them back would have been an act of profound arrogance, a denial of the grace she had shown him. The arrangement continued, but its nature underwent a seismic shift. The invisible wall of shame and resentment between them had been irrevocably breached. Marshall no longer watched from a distance, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He started visiting Lydia's wagon every evening as the sun bled crimson and gold across the plains. His visits were tentative at first, rituals of quiet offering. He wouldn't stay long. He'd bring a piece of dried juniper for her fire that would burn with a fragrant smoke, or a bucket of fresh, cool water from the deepest part of the river. Sometimes he would just stand there, his large frame filling the wagon's opening, his hat in his hands, a man relearning the language of domesticity. He would watch, mesmerized, as Lydia, with a patience that humbled him, fed Abigail with a small spoon, or rocked Caleb, humming a soft, nameless tune that had become the unofficial anthem of their strange, fragile world. One evening, as twilight settled like a purple veil over the camp, Lydia looked up from Caleb's makeshift cradle. "He has your hands," she said, her voice soft in the stillness. She gently lifted the baby's tiny starfish hand for Marshall to see. Strong, stubborn. Marshall felt a painful lump form in his throat. He managed a faint smile, the first genuine smile Lydia had ever seen grace his features. It was a flicker of light in the long twilight of his sorrow. He reached out a hesitant finger and let the baby grip it, the surprising strength a jolt to his heart. "And Abigail has Leora's smile," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to suppress. "Even when she's sleeping, you can see it right at the corners of her mouth." These small moments were stitches, slowly, carefully mending the torn fabric of his life. He found himself speaking of Leora, not in the agonized, whiskey-fueled bursts of his initial grief, but in quiet, reflective tones that honored her memory instead of cursing it. He told Lydia how they had met at a barn raising back in Missouri, how he'd been so clumsy he'd nearly dropped a beam on the preacher. He described Leora's dream of an apple orchard in Oregon, her plans for a white picket fence, her terrible, irrational fear of spiders, and the way she hummed slightly off-key whenever she baked bread. In sharing these memories with Lydia, he was keeping Leora alive, not as a haunting spectre, but as the vibrant, laughing woman she had been. And Lydia listened, providing a silent, steady presence that allowed him to grieve without drowning. She became the keeper of his stories, the guardian of a past she had never known. She in turn found herself opening up to him, unlocking rooms in her heart that had been sealed since her husband's death. She spoke of her quiet life with Thomas, of their shared unspoken sorrow over their childlessness, of the profound loneliness that had consumed her after he was gone. He was a good man. She told Marshall one night, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames of the campfire. He would have loved them so much. They were two solitary souls, bound by a tragedy, and two small children forging a strange and fragile partnership in the vast, indifferent wilderness. They were a tableau of grief and hope, a man learning to be a father, and a woman who had become a mother overnight. Hatcher, however, was not a man to accept defeat. His public challenge had failed his attempt at a coup, thwarted by the very man he sought to depose. So he resorted to more insidious tactics, his malice curdling into a twisted legalistic strategy. He knew the greatest leverage he had was the precarious standing of Lydia's guardianship. He began to work on the more fearful members of the company, those whose nerves were frayed by the long journey and the looming shadow of the Blue Mountains. He cornered William Gable one afternoon as he was greasing his wagon wheels. A terrible shame, the whole situation. Hatcher began, his voice oozing false sympathy. But have you considered what happens when we reach Oregon City? A place with judges with laws. They will look at an unattached woman with no blood ties and a father known to be unstable. He let the word hang in the air. That paper she carries. It was signed under duress. It won't stand up. The children will be made wards of the court. Or worse. He let the implications fester. Worse. The word was a poison dart, conjuring images of grim, overcrowded orphanages of Caleb and Abigail being separated of their futures, being handed over to indifferent strangers. Hatcher's plan was no longer to usurp Marshall. It was to gain control of the children themselves. In the burgeoning, law-starved territory of Oregon, a man who arrived as the benevolent legal guardian of two healthy heirs could control their land claims. Hatcher knew would be prime given Marshall's unparalleled expertise in choosing routes. The children had become nothing more than pawns in his greedy, soulless game. The final confrontation came as the wagon train made its last camp before beginning the arduous ascent into the treacherous Blue Mountains. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. This was the last great barrier, the final test of their endurance, and the mood in the camp was tense. Hatcher chose his moment with theatrical precision. As families gathered for their evening meal, he gathered his small contingent of anxious pioneers and confronted Marshal, Lydia, and Obadiah in the center of the camp, forcing a public audience. Blackwood Hatcher began his tone formal and severe, the voice of a man enacting a painful but necessary duty. On behalf of several concerned families, we must address a grave concern for the welfare of your children. He made a dismissive gesture toward Lydia, who stood holding Abigail, her face pale but resolute. This arrangement is untenable. It has no legal foundation. When we arrive in a civilized territory, The authorities will intervene. For the stability and future of Caleb and Abigail, a proper legal guardian must be established. A man with a claim with resources, a man who can protect their interests. And I suppose you're volunteering for the job? Hatcher Obadiah scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice dangerously near Hatcher's polished boots. I am a man of means and foresight, Hatcher stated smugly, puffing out his chest. I am prepared to formally adopt the children. I have drawn up papers. I will sign them, make it legal and binding. I will ensure their inheritance is protected. It is the only logical, sensible solution. Lydia clutched Abigail so tightly the baby stirred and whimpered. You will not take them. My dear woman, you have no say in the matter. Hatcher sneered, his veneer of civility cracking. You are nothing to them. A temporary nursemaid who coerced a grieving man. The law will see it that way, I assure you. Marshall stepped forward, placing himself between Hatcher and Lydia. He looked tired, the lines on his face carved deeper by the past months, but his eyes were clear and steady. He had spent weeks crawling out of his own grave, and he would not let this vulture drag him back into the darkness. The law marshal said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength that carried to every corner of the silent camp, will see that they are my children. Mine. My name is Blackwood. Their name is Blackwood. Any claim they have is through me, their father, and my late wife. A father who tried to auction them like cattle. Hatcher spat, playing his final venomous card, his voice dripping with theatrical shock. You forfeited your rights that day, Blackwood. These good people are my witnesses. He gestured grandly to the assembled crowd. A wave of shame washed over Marshall's face, a visible tightening of his jaw. But it was fleeting. He held his ground. He did not look at Hatcher. He looked at Lydia, at the trusting child in her arms. Her fierce, protective love, a palpable force. He looked at the faces of the pioneers, their expressions a mixture of fear, pity, and morbid curiosity. He's right. Marshall admitted, his voice raw, with a humility that was more powerful than any denial. The admission stunned the crowd into absolute silence. He is right. On the worst day of my life, consumed by a grief so total, I thought it would kill me. I did a monstrous thing. I tried to cast out the two greatest gifts I have ever been given. I was not a father that day. I was barely a man. I will carry the shame of that morning to my grave. He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. His gaze found Lydia's, a silent communication passing between them. But I was saved from my own madness. I was saved by this woman. Mrs. Abernathy didn't just save Caleb and Abigail from a father who had lost his way. She saved me from myself. She showed me what it means to love when your heart is broken, what it means to have courage in the face of despair, to honor a promise when all hope seems lost. She has been more of a parent to my children these past months than I ever was. He turned his attention from Lydia to the crowd, his voice resonating with a conviction born of fire and pain. Hatcher talks about the law in Oregon City. He talks about papers, claims, and inheritance. But there is a higher law on this trail. It's the law of decency, the law of community. It's the law of looking out for one another when the world is trying to tear you apart. Hatcher sees my children as an opportunity, a claim to be managed, an asset. Lydia sees them as a gift, a life to be nurtured. I ask you, who would you trust with the future? Without waiting for an answer, he walked over to Lydia and gently took Abigail from her arms. He held his daughter against his chest, her small head fitting perfectly in the crook of his neck as he breathed in her scent of milk and clean linen. He then reached down with his free hand and took Lydia's. His large, calloused fingers, which had known only ropes, reins, and rifles, closed around hers with a startling gentleness. It was a simple gesture, but it was a public declaration to the entire company. "This is our family." Marshall said, his voice thick but unwavering. "It is strange, and it is broken, and it was forged in tragedy. But it is ours. Lydia Abernathy is their mother in her heart, and I am their father in my blood. Together we are their guardians, and together we will raise them in Oregon. We will build Lyora's apple orchard, and we will tell them stories of the Mother in heaven who gave them life and the Mother on earth who saved them. That is my final word. If anyone here supports Hatcher's claim over ours, speak now." Absolute silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of a dozen campfires. The pioneers looked at the scene before them. Marshall, the redeemed father, standing tall, Lydia, the steadfast mother, her quiet strength a beacon, the child held protectively between them. Then they looked at Hatcher. His face mottled with rage, his greed and opportunism laid bare for all to see. No one spoke. The few families he had courted looked away ashamed. Obadiah stepped forward, breaking the spell. "I think you've got your answer, Hatcher," he said gruffly. "Now I suggest you see to your wagon. We're moving out in 5 minutes, and you'll be riding at the back of the train from now on. We need to keep an eye on you." Defeated and publicly humiliated, Hatcher stormed away without another word, his grand plans dissolving into the cold mountain air. The crisis was over. The camp seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Marshall looked at Lydia, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears. He was still holding her hand. He didn't let go. "Lydia," he said softly, the name feeling natural on his lips for the first time. I can never repay you. There is no debt to be paid. Marshall," she whispered, her gaze soft but certain. We go on. Together." He nodded, a true, hopeful smile finally reaching his eyes. It transformed his weary face, giving a glimpse of the man he had been and the man he could become again. He looked down at his daughter, then over at his son, who was now awake and being held by a beaming Mrs. Gable. His heart, which he thought had been buried forever by the Sweetwater River, felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in a lifetime. It wasn't the fiery, youthful love he'd had for Lyora. That was a sacred, separate chamber in his heart. This was quieter, gentler, and perhaps in its own way stronger. It was the feeling of a shattered vessel, slowly, miraculously, being made whole again. The long journey was not over, and the mountains loomed before them like a final sleeping giant. But the darkest part of their passage was behind them. They would face what came next, not as a broken man and a lonely woman, but as a family forged in the crucible of the trail, ready to build a new life from the ashes of the old. In the end, Marshall Blackwood and Lydia Abernathy didn't just lead a wagon train to Oregon. They built a family on a foundation of loss, courage, and unwavering decency. Their story is a powerful reminder that our darkest moments do not have to define us. It shows that grief can be a monster, but that love and compassion can be the heroes that defeat it. They proved that a family is not just made of blood, but of promises kept, of hands held in the darkness, and of the shared responsibility for the future. In the wild and unforgiving West, they found their humanity not by claiming land, but by reclaiming each other. If this story of hardship and redemption on the Oregon Trail moved you, please give this video a like to help us share it with more people. Subscribe to our channel for more true tales of the American frontier and hit the share button to pass this incredible story on to someone you know. Thank you for listening.